There we go. So, thank you all for being here this evening. It's lovely to be back in the kind of online space with you all after a few months off from doing our online events. When I saw that Sharbreon was doing this incredible exhibition, I just immediately knew that us here in the UK or anyone else outside of the US, would love to hear about it, especially the quilters in the room, of which I'm sure there are many. So, Sharbreon Plummer. Very, very honored to read this incredible, glorious bio. Sharbreon Plummer, PhD, is an independent researcher, curator, and writer with 15 years of experience in the arts and culture sector. Her research focuses on textile traditions, artistic production, and folkways connected to Black life, especially within the South. She has facilitated and presented work at institutions such as Project Row Houses, the African American Museum in Philadelphia, Rhode Island School of Design, um, Americans for the Arts, Berkeley Art Museum, and Pacific Film Archive, amongst several others. A few of her creative projects include her internationally distributed zine, Diasporic Threads, Black Women, Fibre and Textiles from 2022, published by Common Threads Press, as I'm sure many of you know, one of our first authors who I'm eternally grateful for helping us build this publishing project. Also, part of the incredible People's Quilting Bee with Jess Bailey, another early Common Threads author, also known as Public Library Quilts. She has also been featured as an artist in residence at Rogers Loft Art and Architopia. Dr. Plummer has organised shows such as Stitching Abolition, Mirrored Migration, and is the author of Black Quilts, Memory, Methods, and Medicine, Chronicle Books 2026, which I am absolutely thrilled about and so excited to read. And also, as if this isn't all enough, Dr. Plummer is also an active contributor to Quilt Folk magazine and serves as an editor of Under Uncoverings, the flagship research journal of the American Quilt Study Group. She completed her PhD in Arts Administration, Education, and Policy at the Ohio State University. Now, I am so honored to have Sharbreon here tonight and so excited to hear this talk. Sharbreon's prepared a beautiful presentation for us as well. So now I'm going to, if we were in a room, we would all clap now, but I'm going to hand over to Sharbreon. Thanks for being here, Sharbreon.
Thank you, Laura. Every time people do like the bio read, I'm very shy. So I'm like, oh gosh. But no, it feels so good to be here with you, and with everyone. It's been a joy to work with you thus far. And I'm so happy that we could come together so that our, shared audiences and love of quilts could create this moment. So happy to be here. I am going to get us started. I wish there was a way that Zoom could read my mind and just start things for me, but that's okay. So as Laura shared, I had the immense joy and pleasure to serve as guest curator for Of Salt and Spirit, Black Quilters in the American South, which is currently on view in Jackson, Mississippi at the Mississippi Museum of Art until May 18th. It was extended for those who didn't know. So a little bit of information. The question I always get is, how did you come up with this title? And I would be remiss if I didn't mention Ashley M. Jones, who is a poet. She's from Alabama, and she's actually the poet laureate of Alabama, first Black woman. And she has this beautiful poem that I encourage all of you, if you don't have the catalog, but you still like to see it, there's a few different ways you can view it online, including a live reading of hers. And the poem is titled, I Cannot Talk About the South Without Talking About Black Women, A Golden Shovel after Lucille Clifton. And this is just an excerpt where later on, kind of in the final stanzas, she discusses grandmothers and elders, particularly Black elders of the South, and uses such beautiful language to describe them. And when I saw this of Salt and Spirit line, it really called to me because I thought it spoke to the grit and the resilience and the endurance of so many women that I know, my own family members, but also the spirit and joy and life and levity that they bring to so many of us. And I thought that it was the perfect way to not only describe the show, but given the subject of the poem, it felt like a natural point of overlap. And that was a big curatorial decision for me as I was thinking about how to frame this and how to think about how the work could be presented for me in my own research as a Black feminist scholar, part of what I've come to know, and many of you may already know as well, is that Black feminist authors often utilize quilts as a metaphor within their writing, but even invoke them in their memory in a variety of works, which I could go on, but I'll save that for another day. So it felt important to have their presence in this show as well, and you'll see that a bit more as I go through the presentation. So for me, I'd like, all of us here to think a bit about what and how we see, and in particular as it relates to works by Black women, specifically Black quilters. I know that for many of us, depending on, everybody isn't an art historian or didn't have that training, but there's still a way based on our own knowledge, lived experiences, and even biases. There's the certain way that we see and perceive the world around us, and thus the art and cultural byproducts that are produced. And so I'd like to kick us off with an image. This is an image from the 1860s. It's women and children in a cotton field. And I'd like you, without even giving it a second thought, really quickly, when you see this image, what comes to mind? Now, pause for a couple seconds. You don't have to tell me, you can hold it to yourself, but I'd like you to think about what comes up and also perhaps what an oppositional reading might look like, or a reading that might challenge what you typically would ascribe to such a photo. I love this image in particular. This woman on the far right stands out to me so much because whereas many people may have associated the South and still do with enslavement, understandably so, but also Black people of the South have a particular sort of positioning within society. Um, I think this woman, for me, counters that there's a look of pride in her eyes that I really appreciate in her posture. But for me, when I see these women, I think about some of the earliest shapers of visual culture through quilting. And for those who don't know me, I'm from Louisiana. I'm always talking about home. I'm a proud Southerner. And my biggest gripe is that oftentimes people treat the South as a place that time forgot or a cesspool, especially when it comes to politics. It's like, oh, the South, oh, I'm so sorry. And for me, I know that it's a deeply rich place that's so vast and has so much memory. And when I was thinking about this show, for me, quilting has a home place in the South in particular. And we can't talk about quilts and the history of quilting without talking about Black women and, in particular, Black women's labor. Those two things cannot be separated from one another. And so this show is a way for me to tell a bit more about that story and also challenge how we see and maybe think about what Black quilts are, what they represent, how they quote unquote should look. I like this image because typically, the image on the left, typically when folks think about enslavement, they think about Black women and textile work. They may not even think about textile work, but typically slavery is associated with this notion of unskilled labor. And here on the left, you see this invoice where someone is actually not only invoicing another plantation owner for a piece of cloth, but funds were oftentimes also exchanged for labor performed by people who were enslaved. And Phyllis was the name of this woman who was enslaved, who engaged in skill work around weaving and making. And the image on the right is also a representation of uh, during enslavement, how many women had to understand sort of the nuances from procurement or sourcing of materials to processing of materials to then weaving or assembling them into garments, etc. And as time went on, they continued to do so through quilting. And historically, many of you may know that African American women were typically sort of positioned as assistants, right, or aides, or these dutiful hands to plantation mistresses, but they weren't given the consideration or space to sort of have their own self-determination, to have their own creative practice. There always had to be this sort of influenced by someone else, or this hand of someone else sort of guiding, as though they could not be the authors of beauty or their own creativity, which we know, otherwise. But I want folks to maybe think about or even challenge that notion. And so I like to mention this because, excuse me, at the time, sorry, I'll go back. At the time, if we look at history, not only was there skilled labor happening, but when we think about the economy, enslaved labor is what allowed cotton to boom. That's how cotton became king. Prior to the invention of the cotton gin, it was actually sort of dying out. It wasn't as relevant or prevalent because it just took so much to process things manually. Once the cotton gin was processed, um, millions of pounds of cotton started to be exported worldwide, not just in the US, and it was due to enslaved labor that that was able to take place. And so we get then cotton that's being sort of shipped and promoted everywhere. We see the emergence of textile mills. We see access to material that typically may have been reserved for folks with more means. There's now an ability to utilize textiles in this very domestic way because cotton made these things more affordable and more accessible. But without that labor, that wouldn't have happened. So when I allude to sort of quilting having a home place in the South, but also being deeply interconnected to Black life and the labor of Black women, that's what I'm referring to. And as we know, folks choose to sort of highlight or celebrate the histories that they want to based on their own interests. And my interest will be and continues to be in uncovering hidden histories and celebrating the life and legacies and stories that are deeply intertwined with my culture. And so I see this show as both a celebration and a response. Black Southern quilters, I remember when I first started this research, very often they would be relegated to sort of improvisation. And I tell this story all the time where I remember when I first said, okay, I want to do this research. There was a time where on Google you could find G's Ben and Faith Ringgold, and that was it. And I had a moment where I was like, I know this isn't it. I know there are other things. And, I would find different books, Commune of the Spirits, which I'll talk about in a moment. But still, I was like, there should be more and there can be more. And not only that, but Black women of a certain generation who were based in the South oftentimes got grouped with G's Ben. And so improvisation, this notion of improvisation and sort of these West African retentions in quilting became the foundation for how people then defined quilts by African American quilt makers. So for me, there was and still remains a need for repair and mending and correcting to say, yes, we celebrate G's Ben, we celebrate the work of these women, and there's a sort of need for a deeper call to look at the depth and breadth of African American quilt making as championed by folks like Dr. Carolyn Maslumi of the Women of Quilters Network and Roland Freeman, who deeply inspired this show. And so one of the big questions that really anchors this show is what does it mean to take a reparative approach towards preserving quilt history? And by reparative, I mean not only correcting, but also referencing and invoking sources, research, voice, lived experience from the people that not only produce these quilts, but those who are directly impacted by them. So, a little bit more context. This show could not have been possible without the work of Roland L. Freeman, who unfortunately passed away recently. And he was the creator of A Commune of the Spirits. Prior to that, he had a really robust career as a photo documentarian. He documented the mule train from the South to DC, in addition to several different elements of folkways and folk life across the South. But A Commune of the Spirits still remains sort of the only book of its kind that examines the inner worlds, the interiority, so to speak, of Black women quilters, not just in the South, but across the US. And so, for those who may not know, the Mississippi Museum of Art got a gift of Roland Freeman's estate, a good chunk of it. There's also plenty of archives I recommend you look at. It's through University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill. They have a bunch of beautiful scans and things like that. But back to the MMA, they received over 100 quilts from his personal collection that were, many of them were included in a Commune of the Spirits, but also archival boxes. And he was a wonderful record keeper, inspired me to maybe get a little bit more organized, but did beautiful work in not only documenting these stories, but capturing them in a way that also showed to me an ethic of care in archiving and interviewing and doing folk work. And so, as you'll see in a forthcoming slide, he would have forms where they were not only sort of permission or consent forms, but he would ask questions to give context to the quilts that dove into these women's lives, how they learned, Under every slip, he would take a Polaroid and attach it so you had an image of the person that accompanied the work and the story. And to me, that was in direct response to, the history and sort of legacy of anonymous quilters, particularly anonymous Black quilters that were oftentimes presented in exhibitions at the Smithsonian and other places throughout history. And so here are just some examples of some works from A Communion of the Spirit and other projects. Not only was he beautifully skilled, but he did a wonderful job of taking the quilts and sort of having them in their quote unquote natural habitat. He would position them in such a way where, yes, stylistically, they were beautifully arranged, but they were in their homes. They were shown in a way that was loving, that was caring, and that celebrated the beauty and diversity in how they were made and created. And so here we have Nikki Giovanni and her mother. We have someone working on a porch frame in the way that they typically would have. There's this woman who's from Mississippi. She's right outside of her home. And he also just had such a beautiful eye, I think, and a level of care and respect and reverence for elders. And he captured them in ways that really centered their humanity and for me told such a rich and wonderful story. And here's just, I know some people, I'm a process person. I love a process shot, so I thought it would be fun to include these. But here you see he kept transcripts, oftentimes multiple versions. This is a conversation he had with Herdicine Rankin. In the folders, he would have labels on the back of images. He would have them labeled. And part of why I include this is because I really believe in the power of the archive. And I feel like people are everyday archivists, quilters in their own way are archivists. And so I'd love for all of us to think about, what are the stories that we want to archive and how, and what's the work that we can do today. And my running joke is always, the best time to archive is yesterday. The second best time is today, is right now. So it's never too late to dig into that process. This is a page or two pages that are pulled out of the catalog. And I thought it was really important for folks to understand all of the work that went into making this possible. So often in museums and art spaces, we're used to seeing the final project, right? We see the work, we come, we appreciate it, but we oftentimes don't understand process. And so I wanted folks to be able to see, and we have in the show an area that's solely dedicated to Roland's process. And it actually features this quote here in blue that says, when you accept the people you are studying as your friends and extended family, you develop a different relationship than if you look at them as subjects or informants. And I thought that quote was so poignant and really summarized his process really well, and even my own process as a researcher an interviewer because I see many of these women as extensions of myself. They could be my mother, my grandmother, my aunt. And Roland was adamant about becoming embedded in these folks' lives and building community. When he would travel, he would stay with folks. If you read Communion of the Spirits, you'll see that this wasn't sort of a one time, oh, I'm going to come do this interview and leave. There were decades of trips back and forth and different conversations, and many people he stayed in touch with up until they transitioned. And so I just wanted people to be able to see some of the stills, also these really sweet circles that sort of show you, okay, he settled on this picture. He really enjoyed that one, as well as some of those forms that I mentioned in other transcripts. And here are just a few installation shots for folks who can't see it. So, or who can't see the show. Robin Dietrich, who's the exhibition designer, did a phenomenal job. I told her one of my favorite blocks was a log cabin, and even when you initially enter into the show, you see this sort of tribute to Roland and many of the quilters. I wanted them to be the first people that you see and you encounter versus the quilts, because the show really is about them first and foremost. And here is her sort of abstraction of a log cabin block, which I adore. And throughout the show, you see all of these really sweet touches. I also thought it was important for folks to be able to see the backs because, we love a quilt back for the ones that made the most sense. And so I'm really proud that we could suspend some And in each section, which each I have four sections that are themed throughout the show, I wanted to highlight and blow up some of those images and pictures because, again, in thinking about this reparative approach, I tend to be a very sort of people first, object second curator, and not in this hierarchical way, but in a way that I feel like for quilts and for Black artists in particular, um, I don't want us to be divorced from our work. And I know how often quilters sort of get grouped and summed up together as a whole. And for me, I wanted to tell distinct stories. I wanted the quilts to be able to, yes, shine, but also be able to celebrate the everyday life that gave shape to these works. These works were inspired by place, by lived experience, by personal creativity that was born and sort of cultivated through the South. And so I wanted that to be as present as possible. And so now I'll get a little bit into the four sections. So throughout the show, there are four sections: homecoming, the gathering, aesthetics of place, and bound by love. And how I landed on these four sort of themes is that, I don't know about you, but I could go on and on and on about quilts. So I said, okay, if I'm gonna put this into a context that multiple people can absorb and understand, and if I wanted to tell a story about the South, but in a kind of confined way, what's the story that I would tell? And so these four themes for me sort of bring together this story of Black quilts and Black quilters in the South. So homecoming looks at the sort of South as a birthplace. The gathering looks at the art of working together and collaboration, sisterhood, kinship. Excuse me, aesthetics of place examines how there is no sort of singular way of defining a Black quilt, especially a Black Southern quilt. And then Bound by Love looks at the familial relationships and dynamics, whether born family by blood or chosen kin, the relationships that come together to make quilts possible. And so each section has a corresponding color that matches what you see here. And the section is anchored by a quote from a Black woman, writer, poet, artist that I thought could give some added context to the quilt or to the quilts and to the section. And so Margaret Walker, I chose a poem for Farish Street because of her history, of course, in life in Mississippi, but also because the show begins in Mississippi. Farish Street is a very important street in Jackson. It has a lot of history. And during Reconstruction, it became essentially the place where Black folks were able to settle and create life when there was segregation. And it was once a really thriving hub and community. And so this quote that I pulled out says, "A patchwork quilt. This street is like my grandma's patchwork quilt. Kaleidoscope appliqued with multicolored threads of embroidery, a golden sun, blue skies, carpeted with the green, the yellow, the red, the white, the black, the brown, and the checkered." And this section really, highlights things that I felt were either fun, like this chicken's quilt that me and the curators at the museum loved. I thought it was nice to, both have visual cues and references to everyday life in the South, especially thinking about the 19th and early to mid 20th century. But I also wanted to reference patterns that may have felt more traditional or invoked certain memories for folks about the South and these notions of home. So chickens is one of the ones that we included, kind of this really sweet and fun nod to agrarian life in the region. And I bring these quotes up in particular. These are from the WPA slave narratives. They have their own complications, right? But I love that these exist because as I sort of scoured through them and I was doing research, quilts and quiltings and quilting bees sort of came up repeatedly. And I just encourage folks to look into that. But I wanted to include them here because, in addition to what I referenced um, prior about the sort of creation of textiles and cultivation of cotton, throughout, the South, these women came together to build up the art of quilting over several decades, over centuries, as sort of a communal and refined practice. And we see it referenced by folks who were formerly enslaved. Quilts really were at the backdrop of everyday life and engagement. And so I really wanted to celebrate that within this section. So here we have Log Cabin by Bertha Carr. You can't talk about quilts and origin stories without digging into the log cabin, right? We have quilts like pants leg, breeches quilts were very common. Folks included work clothes that were no longer sufficient for everyday wear and use, but could be utilized to create a quilt. And though this quilt was created in 1995, I thought it was really sweet and lovely that they were very intentional about naming it that. And I think it spoke to sort of like that generational memory that's also passed down through quilting. Clancy's Beauty Salon. These are actually two sisters that work together, Clancy and Tammy McGrew. Many of us have memories of waking up on Sunday mornings, having our mothers do our hair, and just that love and sort of intimacy between mother and daughter that exists in that sort of ritual and practice. So I brought that in to celebrate that. And I should also say this is not comprehensive. There's over 50 quilts in this show, so I won't be able to show them all, but I wanted to spotlight some key ones. And then I also wanted to include quilts that spoke to maybe some things that weren't as sort of sweet or light. Even though Parchment Prison by Herdicine Rankin is gorgeous, this is one of my favorite quilts. It's huge. It's 83 by 95 roughly. At first glance, you see all these colors. And to be honest, it was really unassuming for me too until I dug into it. And believe it or not, Miss Rankin created this quilt as sort of a visual representation of and response to the carceral system and incarceration, and her seeing so many people who were an extension of her community in prison. So these colorful blocks actually represent the prisoners, and the triangles and these sort of batik-ish looking prints represent the bars and the guards that sort of enclose and surround them. And this is her sort of interpretation of, seeing so many young Black men in particular incarcerated at the time. So I think this is a really clear example of, sort of speaking to maybe some of the challenges of place, because a lot of Southern states have the highest incarceration rates in the world, but in a way that is really subversive and really beautiful and ahead of its time, in my opinion. The second section is called The Gathering, and there's a quote from Toni Morrison's Beloved where it says, "She is a friend of my mind. She gathered me, man. The pieces I am, she gathered them and give them back to me in all the right order." And it felt really important for me to highlight the notion of gathering because in the earlier days, quilts, the way that they got completed, sort of en masse, is that many women got together and quilted in their homes, quilted day, night, on the porch. It was a collective activity. But even in more contemporary times, I've worked with a lot of quilt guilds, and so many women in particular who are part of African American quilt guilds discuss how they started the guilds because they didn't feel welcomed in spaces that weren't culturally specific. Their work was challenged. The work that they did was questioned. If they didn't follow quote unquote traditional methods, then they were oftentimes ostracized or they felt bullied. And so they went on to build sisterhood through guilds and also informal spaces for gathering. And so what you'll see in this section are a lot of examples of collective work. Crossroads Quilters, which is based in Port Gibson, Mississippi. They did a lot of community work, especially with art students in the 90s and early 2000s, or should I say 80s into early 2000s, when they were most active. And so this is an example of a quilt that they did with students. There are also a lot of quilts where you can see one person may have started the initial design and it was collectively quilted together. This is String Star by Essie Mae Buck, which is gorgeous and was quilted by the Crossroads Quilters. She was part of that collective as well. I also, to kind of think about this notion of gathering and working collectively, and also sort of the healing and restoration that can come through quilting in particular for Black women, I included this specific example of Memories by Herdicine Rankin. She's also made quilts about her father's death. In short, the story behind that is when she was a young girl, her father was murdered and left in the street. And it took a few hours for him to be retrieved, and it was very traumatic for her. And in meeting Roland and working with him, She actually came to create a quilt that was about his death. And through that, in one of the transcripts I was reading, she talks about how it freed her. It kind of lifted this burden off of her. And it was through that relationship building and the art of quilting that she was able to sort of find a place to place that grief. And even this quilt at the top, or sorry, this quote at the top says, "Quilting with me, I can say it relaxes you. It's a happiness I can't describe when I'm quilting. I was always a real nervous person, but today the quilting has quieted me down." I included these two immediately after because they, in some ways, were, students, so to speak, of Miss Rankin. Geraldine Nash and Miss Christina Atlas. Both Miss Nash and Miss Atlas were both Crossroads quilters who also studied under and sort of refined their skill under Herdicine Rankin. And I put them in one because they make amazing quilts, and thankfully they're still living, so they were able to be present and be a part of the show. But also because I wanted to show how with these relationships, Miss Rankin had her own technique, right? So does Miss Nash and Miss Atlas. None of the quilts are exactly alike. So even for Miss Rankin, this sort of act of gathering and imparting knowledge was less about saying, you make what I make, but more about saying, let me give you the skills to then find your voice and develop the aesthetics that speak best to you. So Miss Nash, for example, is like a masterful hand piecer. All of this is hand pieced and quilted. She does amazing work. Miss Atlas loves color, and you see a lot of that represented in her work as well. And so I really love that story. If you have the catalog, there's an interview with them and Precious Lavelle that was facilitated by Lydia Jasper. And they talk about how when they were studying with Miss Rankin or quilting with her, if something was wrong, she would always tell them, you have to pick it or loose. That was the words that nobody wanted to hear. You have to pick it or loose. But she was particular, but she wanted folks to be able to do their best. Section 3 is aesthetics of place. If you've known me long enough, you know I can't talk about quilts without citing a chapter from Bell Hooks's Belonging, A Culture of Place. And the quote that anchors this section says, "We are deeply, passionately connected to Black women whose sense of aesthetics, whose commitment to ongoing creative work inspire and sustain. We reclaim their history, call their names, state their particulars to gather and remember, to share our inheritance." And so I felt, again, as I mentioned earlier, that it was really important to be able to talk about quilting in the South without leaning into one particular sort of presentation. I wanted there to just be a richness of color, of style, of technique. And so this section really includes a little bit of everything. It's a smorgasbord of quilts, and it's one of my favorites. And one of the quilts that I really love in this section is Necktie in a Circle by Miss Phoebe Johnson. And for a little bit of context, as you can see, she was born in 1883 and quilted up until she passed away. And so, I just find it really inspiring thinking about her not only keeping with this tradition, but also how her style sort of evolved over time. And there are multiple quilts of hers in the show where you can sort of see this evolution based on the decade of how she was making. And this is both hand pieced and hand quilted. Here's another example from 1973 of her Devil's Dream quilt. And I thought this was a really just lovely example of technical skill, but also risk taking. It's so bright. You see the grandma's fan sort of hand quilting that gives it that texture. And to me, I think this is just so rich and colorful. And the picture here is actually a bit subdued. It's a lot brighter in person. But I thought it was a good example of like challenging notions of what a Black Southern quilt is. I didn't shy away from things that were a bit improvisational, like this quote by Mabel Williams. But what I want folks to reconsider when they think about improvisation is that, it's not always just this thing by happenstance. I think, despite the intentions, what that has done oftentimes for Black quilters is put them in this position to almost be savant-like, right? Especially women who are from poor rural areas. There's sort of this notion of who would have thought they could make something so beautiful. But as many of you know who quilt, even something like this requires an understanding of color, a deep consideration and thought about placement. And there is planning that happens even into things that don't necessarily feel as though they have a rhyme or reason. It may not be derived from a pattern, but there is intention and sort of a skill that's pulled from in order to create something that seems like it didn't require a lot of thought. To me, the work that's most successfully done in that way is done by people who have built that skill over time. Because I don't know about y'all, I can kind of do improv, but I love a pattern. I love some guidance and direction. So when people are able to be free, they've built up that muscle. And then this is another example. It's so fun. I have a lot of fun with this one all the time. It's by Mary Mayfair Matthews. It was to me one of the great examples in the collection of something that's a bit more of like a pictorial story quilt. It's these vignettes of her life, early life, originally in Mississippi, then she lived in Tennessee, and she was actually a doll maker. So you can kind of see, and excuse me, there are a lot of applique figures, but you can kind of see that touch in hand. And this was one of the quilts that, to think about challenging how people think about Black Southern quilts, it included so many different materials. You can't really see it that well here, but there was lace, there's metallic thread, there's beading, there's applique, there's so many different things that I think push against this notion of tradition, especially for something that may have come out of the region at the time in which she made it. And so I wanted to include this here, both for some levity. I thought it was really fun and playful, but to also show more technical variety. I'm also watching time, so I'm going to go through this quickly so we have room for questions. The last section is titled Bound by Love. And this is drawing from Alice Walker's In Search of Our Mother's Gardens. And the quote says, and so our mothers and grandmothers have more often than not anonymously handed on the creative spark, the seed of the flower they themselves never hoped to see, or like a sealed letter they could not plainly read. And so a lot of the quilts in this section are made by mothers and daughters or are done collaboratively. And one of the things I didn't speak to earlier, but is present in the show, is that when you exit, we have multiple images that were taken by Roland and framed, as you see here, with these quilted mat boards. And he had the privilege of interviewing Dr. Maya Angelou. And I thought it was important to reference this here because in her transcript, she talks about how in summary, she had writer's block. And she had just come off of, winning a major award, wanted to write this book. She knew it would be challenging. And her mother gave her this quilt and said, you go outside and you sit on that and you'll be able to write. And she goes on to discuss how it liberated her and how that experience really sort of gave her the strength that she needed to push through. And I thought that story was a really beautiful example of what this section means. So, a bit more directly, you have certain sort of quilts that were made in the home in partnership. For example, Phoebe Johnson. So another example of her work. This is quilted by her daughter, Annie Dennis, who is a phenomenal quilter as well. And the other daughter, Emma Russell, was someone else who worked collaboratively with her mother and sister Annie. This quilt, Bits and Pieces by Mary Mayfair Matthews, I thought was beautiful to include. And I included it. It's one of the few in this section that's not collaborative, but I included it because I did some research and it comes to find out that Miss Matthews actually really thrust herself into working as an artist full time after the loss of her son. And so, I thought about how, in some ways, her ability to process grief came through quilting and making this work. And it was through this deep love of her son and the loss that she felt that she was able to transmute that energy into some amazing and profound works. And so I wanted to be able to uplift that as well. I'm really proud that we could include this piece by Elizabeth T. Scott and Joyce J. Scott, Monsters, Dragons, and Flies. Even though Joyce Scott grew up in Baltimore, her mother was from the South. And so I thought this was also a really great way to bridge the story of the Great Migration, these memories and cultural retentions that sort of carried during that time, and how that's imparted between mother and daughter. And these are just a few stills from the show, just some outtakes I thought that were really beautiful. But I felt really proud that we could create an exhibit that allowed folks to feel seen and to feel affirmed. And it's my hope that, as you see these folks spectating here and you look at quilts in galleries moving forward, when you go see different shows, that you'll pause to maybe reconsider how you see what you see and maybe some of the things that aren't stated and the work that you'll do to maybe elevate those stories and hidden histories as well. Thank you.
Amazing. Thank you, Sharbreon. I'm just gonna juggle things around. Um, there we go. That's spotlight. Okay, now the two of us should be on the screen. Okay, amazing. That was fantastic. Thank you so much. I I love how personal it is for you as well, Shambri, I love how deeply invested you are in these stories and this research, and it definitely comes through in your curatorial work. And I love the idea of approaching the kind of people as much as the objects or before the objects. Um, I could yap on for a long time, but I won't. The first question, Margaret asked, are there any plans for the exhibit to travel?
Yes. So currently, I know on the docket are the Memphis Brooks Museum, as well as the museum at UNC Greensboro, so North Carolina. But there's still others in the queue, so more to come. But North Carolina and Tennessee are for sure on the calendar. And if you are interested, there's still room to discuss it coming to you. Although I know UK may be another story, but that would
Yeah.
be my dream.
That would be incredible. Yeah, I would personally love that. Um so I'll just if you have any questions for Chabrion, do share them in the chat. It'd be lovely to hear from you. And yeah, I'm sure it was nice to know that there's probably some quilters and crafters in the group, so you could kind of speak specifically to that audience as well, which is really lovely. So maybe I'll just ask one just to get the ball rolling. Um, I Something that I wanted to ask you about was kind of the reception to the exhibition since it's open, and you kind of mentioned at the end that it's been a space for people to feel seen and those histories to be held, but obviously there'll be contemporary quilters, in the area surrounding the exhibition even. Have you heard much from kind of the local community of quilters, who are working today, and what's kind of been their reaction to it, if you will?
Sure, that's actually a really great question. And I'm proud to share that when working with the museum, one of the things that I was adamant about, and thankfully they have a wonderful education department. They also agreed to is thinking about how they could engage folks locally. So one of the things that wasn't in the presentation, but I'll share a bit more about, is that outside of the exhibit, there's sort of this small hall. It almost could be treated kind of like a seating area, but it's a flex space. And that actually features the work from three local quilters, contemporary quilters, one of whom is actually a docent at the museum, Miss Stephanie. So that was a really beautiful
Lovely.
moment of serendipity. But their work is hung and suspended, but they are all three, they have 2 months each in the galleries doing work and workshops with community members.
Amazing.
So yeah, there's a sort of maker space where folks can go in on any other day and make their own sort of quilt block and hang it up. But even outside of that, Raven, Dr. Janice, and Miss Stephanie are all doing programming there as well. So that's been really lovely to see. And I think even local quilters, they felt great about it. I think being able to celebrate quilts in Mississippi and have this sense of pride of home felt important, because Mississippi oftentimes doesn't get that deserved attention. And so I think the two of those things coming together have made for an even richer sort of local experience, but I think has made folks even more receptive to the show.
That's lovely, and I think exhibitions are as much their program as they are the objects on the inside, aren't they?
Yeah.
So a question from Elisa. This was a really incredible talk. Could you speak to the logistical or conservation concerns involved in hanging a quilt in the center of a space? That's interesting, and it was one of those moments where I was like, you can tell that Chabrian's a maker because, as you said in the talk, the quilts were hung so that we could see the back of them, which everyone wants to see.
All the time. It's so hard because people, everybody wants to touch too.
Mm.
But Elisa, that's a great question. So before I go into a detailed answer, I didn't have an image, but in addition to the vertical quilts, We even had a custom platform built for one that I wanted to hang, which I think kind of gets to your question, but knew it was not in a place to potentially be hung because it was a bit fragile. Um, I know some people tend to be perfectionists and they want, the quilts to be pristine. Many of them were for use, right? So they had tears, they showed wear essentially, and or love, as I like to call it. They were well loved. And so from there, you really have to look at. We did an examination of the ones that I felt had a fun sort of back that folks might enjoy. We did really careful examination with the curatorial team as well in the archives to say, okay, this looks sound like these stitches still feel like they are solid enough to be able to withstand sort of just gravity naturally doing its thing. But for the one that's laying down, I wanted folks to be able to engage with it. And that was a really nice compromise because somebody could kind of see it and it would invoke this feeling of like a bed. But logistically speaking, there's a way that we built out the platform where you can get close, but not so close that it could potentially, knock the quilt down or do anything like that. So from the presentation perspective, you have to think about how the viewer can engage while also sort of giving the quilt a little bit of protective space.
Mhm.
Yeah, and I think examining the stitches and sort of the overall construction and soundness of the quilt, and also looking at the dates and the age of the quilt, like can it actually withstand being able to be mounted and supported in this way? So lots of careful examination.
Nice. And Mary asks, in my research as a PhD student, I've noticed a resurgence in all things quilting over the last 5 years or so. Everything from clothing, pop culture, museum exhibitions, and collecting, and people returning to the practice of quilting as well. I have a thought about why this might be, but I'm curious if you have any ideas about this as well.
Yeah, quilts continue to have a resurgence. I could speculate about why. I mean, so there's sort of the notion of within the art world, there are things that continue to trend. And then I think depending on where we are societally and what's happening with folks, this notion of sort of perhaps reuse or engaging in more domestic tasks that tends to reemerge as well. So even with the pandemic, like a lot of people took up needlework and quilting and other things. And then with America, from a quilt perspective, anytime there's some sort of national celebration, like the bicentennial, the 250th is coming up, you start to see that sort of rebirth or, you know, interest that reemerges in quilts and quote unquote domestic tasks or things that might represent this notion of like Americana and American history and things like that. So yeah, so I mean, things naturally trend. I feel like quilts are having another movement in part because of people thinking about perhaps art differently, place, home. It could be the 250th. There's so many elements. It's all speculative in my opinion, but those are maybe some of the things that emerge as I think about that.
Mm, lovely. Um, and one question, which is a very, yeah, practical one, but I will ask is when will diasporic threads come back in stock? So we haven't officially announced this yet, but diasporic threads came out in tw August 2022, so almost 3 years ago. And a lot's changed. For anyone who knows Common Threads will know a lot has changed with Common Threads in that time. And we are basically gonna give it a little zhuzh, a little makeover. It's gonna keep the same kind of brand identity, but we're just gonna give it a little spruce up and update some things and tighten up some things and yeah, just make it as beautiful as possible. So it's temporarily out of stock whilst we're working on the new design, just because boring practical reason it wasn't worth me ordering a big print run of it if we're going to be updating it in a couple of months anyway. So yes, it will be back in stock soon, probably in the summer, all being well. But thanks for asking. And yes, I'm due a kind of announcement on social media about this. But I will, yeah, share more details as they come. And do we have any other questions? Or Christine's asked about a contact in UNC Greensboro to see quilts. I don't know if that's Sharbreon something you can answer off the top of your head, or maybe Christine could leave their email address and you could follow up, or
Yeah, there's a group there. So the show won't, I know for sure the show won't be there until I think it, if I don't want to misspeak, but if I'm not mistaken, it'll be late summer to fall of next year. And they'll put out everything it'll be the campus museum. Um, I can think of that. I don't know the email off the top of my head, but the museum staff there could speak to it. Right now they wouldn't have a ton of information just because we're trying to finalize the dates. But once the show is confirmed to travel, there will be a bevy of promotional material. So if you just look up UNC Greensboro's campus museum,
Mm,
it'll be one of their upcoming exhibitions.
great, perfect. Um, cool. Question from Ben. I really liked your approach to put emphasis on the people behind the quilts. Do you have suggestions on how other exhibits could do the same? Great question.
Thanks, Ben. I would say, oh, that's a great question. I have my thoughts, but I was like, I want to be positive. I don't want to give a snarky response. But I will say, I think one in part it has a lot to do with the curator and the curator's approach. And I think just when you think about quilts in particular, you can't treat them as you would a two-dimensional painting or like perhaps more traditional, as folks might call it, art forms or sculpture, things like that. Quilts, as we know, are so entrenched in a legacy of memory keeping and storytelling that even from a curatorial perspective, the research you do and the things that you inquire about should be a bit different. I also think that just when you think you have enough information about a quilt, you could always dig a bit more. So I would definitely dedicate more time to do a bit of research and maybe think about community connections. And then also, even just from a place of presentation, think about the stories that you want to tell. And especially if the quilts are produced by a group of people or individuals that are historically marginalized, it's the museum's responsibility to think about, like I said, that notion of repair and how they can do things a bit differently or better to perhaps remedy some of the ways that the works and the people have been treated in the past.
Great, perfect answer, I think. Catherine's asked, how do the women who made the quilts feel about having their work displayed in a gallery space?
Thrilled. They were so excited. At the opening, Miss Geraldine came with her daughter, and her daughter was crying. Like there were lots of happy tears. And frankly, I think for a few of them it was long overdue. Um, I'm also really proud that for the women who were no longer living, there were actually a couple of folks I got to speak with, and their family members' quilts were included. And they were like, we always felt like they were works of art and we loved them, but now it's good to know that they could be appreciated in a different way.
Mm,
And so, yeah, I think they felt a sense of pride and excitement. And I know for some of the other quilters who knew the women who were on the walls who maybe couldn't be there anymore, there was an extended sense of pride on their behalf.
that's really lovely. I can just picture it and just imagine it. It's yeah, it must have been glorious and thrilling for you to see that
Mhm.
response and meet those people. Cool. So we're coming up to time, but we maybe have time for one more question if anyone wants to put one in the chat. Cool. Lulu asked, will the quilters and their families benefit financially from the exhibition?
That's a great question, Lulu. So for there's a sort of twofold answer. For licensing and any sort of use, there's a separate process for that, absolutely. Um, it's my understanding that based on the show itself, I don't believe like there's a percentage that goes to X, Y, and Z, but anything that is for use, for attribution, for inclusion, they get not only recognition, but there is a tangible material resource that comes from that.
Great.
And the quilts that were collected leading up to that, they were compensated for. So this wasn't a matter of like a handoff in that way. The museum collected quilters from Mississippi, and those were formal acquisitions that quilters were paid equitably for. And then when Roland collected his quilts, they weren't necessarily gifted or undercharged. They were paid equitably as well because he was working to combat some of the work that had been done from other collectors and scholars in the past from the exploitation.
Great. Thank you, Sharbreon. And then another one from Mary. Just curious if you have seen or are going to see We Gather at the Edge contemporary quilts by Black women artists at the Renwick in DC.
I absolutely plan on going. Dr. Mazlumi is a mentor and a guide and a dear friend who I actually spoke to before we got on here. So I'm excited to be able to go support that show because it's built from her collection and she's been such a gift to me and my life. So I'm glad you plugged that because folks should definitely go
Yes.
check it out.
It's kind of like the contemporary sister of your exhibition,
Mhm.
isn't it? Gosh, sometimes I really wish I lived in the US for these great exhibitions. Great. So we're perfectly on time, everyone. Thank you, Sharbreon, and thank you everyone for being here this evening. It's been an absolute joy and really lovely to have you all here and to hear from Sharbreon about this show. It was, yeah, a great way to connect to the exhibition without having to travel, even though I still wish I could. Okay, that's everything for the evening.